Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Philosophy.
And we will be going over Hume Section II in an inquiry concerning human understanding. Now, this lecture is going to focus on the perceptions of the mind. There are two that Hume distinguishes: the perception of the mind that focuses on feelings, and then the perception of the mind that recollects. And we're going to move on to ideas and impressions. And then we finish the section with the argument from Hume that states all of our ideas are copies of our impressions. And he gives two arguments for this, and then a counterexample, and then we'll go to a conclusion. Now, philosophy can be controversial at times, and Hume is a very controversial individual, because if you haven't realized yet, he is an atheist. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of his beliefs, but as a student of philosophy, like you, we are just going to analyze his arguments and his conclusions. He does come from a wealthy Scottish family, so he does have an aristocratic type of mentality. But like I said, we're just here to focus on the arguments that he makes and really delve into what he is trying to say, because before Hume, rationalists did take certain things for granted, and Hume was strong enough to even wake the most rationalist philosopher Immanuel Kant from his dogmatic slumber. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Perceptions of the mind. So right off the bat in Section 2, Hume states, everyone will readily allow that there is a considerable difference between the perception of the mind, where a man feels the pain of excessive heat or pleasure of moderate warmth, and when afterward he recalls to his memory this sensation. So he distinguishes two kinds of perceptions of the mind. We have the one that feels, and we have one that recollects. The one that feels is very lively. It's the one where I burn myself and I instantly feel pain. Or when you finally graduate and you feel satisfaction of accomplishment and the joy of reaching your goals. Then you have the perception of the mind that recalls. He says it recalls to memory this sensation or anticipates it by his imagination. They mimic or copy but never reach the full force and vivacity of the original sentiments. When we reflect on our past sentiments and affections, our thought is a faithful mirror. It tries to copy exactly what we were going through. It tries to remember what we were feeling, but it never comes close to the vivacity of the original sentiment, which leads Hume to conclude that the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. And this makes sense because in our minds, we cannot recall the same pain we felt when we jammed our foot. Where you'll walk into that same table that's been in your house since you can remember, and you walk into it again and you feel that rush of pain. Or when you're stepping out of your car and you hit your funny bone. None of the recollections of those past experience will reach the potency of the original perception in the mind that felt it at that point in time. So he distinguishes these two. And these two distinguishing perceptions of the mind really leads him towards what we're going to go through in the next slide, when he separates what he calls ideas from impressions. Now that Hume realizes these two perceptions of the mind, he states, we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into two classes or species that are distinguished by their different degrees of force and vivacity. So he is separating these two by the degree of force, how potently we experience them. And so he has the ideas, or thoughts, as he says in the beginning, which are the less forcible and lively. Basically, a reflection of the past sensation. And then you have the impressions, what is impressed upon us from the world, which are the more lively perceptions when we hear, see, or feel, or love, or hate, or desire, or will. The impressions are distinguished from ideas. The ideas are being the less lively of perceptions, which are conscious. We reflect on any of these sensations or movements that were mentioned above. When we reflect upon what we saw, or we reflect upon what we felt, or we reflect upon love or hate or desire, it isn't as strong as the impressions of these feelings. And so these are the two distinguishing factors we have now. And, Hume he's making his way towards something, and you can really tell like he's just laying out the groundwork right now. But for our benefit, you can see that there is a difference between what is impressed upon us from the outside world and when we recall it afterwards. We're never going to say that what has been impressed upon me from the outside world when I get angry at a person in the situation, your face turns red and you get just this, Hulk-like anger. You're never going to say that when you recall it later, like a month later, and you remember that time, you're never going to say that that idea you had about that moment was just as potent as your feelings in that moment. So Hume does have something here. There is a difference between an impression and an idea. But here's something I want to just put out there. Does this solve the dream argument? Because what Hume is saying is the ideas we have in our mind are less forcible than the sensory experience that's impressed upon us from the outside world. And that the ideas may be a faithful mirror, but will never copy the vivacity of the impressions. So for Descartes, when you're awake, when you're being impressed upon the outside world with such vivacity. But Descartes, the reason why the dream argument is still being argued today was because the potential for you to be dreaming exists, where people suffer from night terrors, and in their sleep they do feel the potent sensation of fear because they believe it wholeheartedly to be true. So these are things to think about, because Hume is going to be directing his attention towards Descartes often in his inquiry concerning human understanding. Ideas. So now we're getting into the controversial area with Hume, and I'm going to reiterate, I'm not expressing my beliefs here. I'm just explaining what Hume is arguing. So Hume starts with, our thoughts seem to possess this unbound liberty we shall find upon nearer examination that is really confined within very narrow limits, where all these faculties of reason that we believe we have, quote unquote, amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by sense experience. Okay. So what he's saying here is that everything that's impressed upon us from the outside world creates this faithful mirror in our ideas. And while our ideas, our rational ability to understand the outside world. We believe this rational faculty is unlimited and unbound in its ability to think up things. And in some certain aspects, it is unbound, because I can think of the ultimate form of perfection. I can think of the ultimate power of God, for example. We have this idea of God, and this points exactly to Descartes. Remember, Descartes argued that he has this idea of God, and it must have come from somewhere. Therefore, there exists a God simply because the fact I can think of a God. Yeah, this is specifically towards him. We have this unbelievable ability to think of things in extremes, but when we examine it, he's saying that everything we come up with in our mind is merely compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials that we gained from the outside world. So Hume says, for example, take a gold mountain. And we have the picture of this beautiful gold mountain on the bottom of my slide. The idea of a pure gold mountain in my mind is just compounding my sensory experience of gold and a sensory experience of a mountain, and we're putting it together. When I see a virtuous horse, I don't know how many of you watch Secretariat, but we have this idea of this horse that can't give up. You know, this horse that has this feeling of never giving up, this unrelenting will. What we're doing is we can conceive of our idea of unrelention or virtuous attitudes, and we compound that with the horse. And in philosophy, we call that anthropomorphizing something. When we take ideas or feelings from a human being and apply those to other things. Oh, that computer is cute. Oh, that animal is smart. Not that animals can't be smart, but you know what I mean. What we're doing is we're taking our ideas and our feelings and we're compounding them with outside sources. And that word again was anthropomorphizing. Ooh, tongue twister indeed. So this is where he states his big philosophical conclusion. And he states, I'm going to say this in philosophical language for all you philosophers who are studying this. All of our ideas are copies of our impressions. So it's like, whoa, hold the phone here. So the rationalists are working with faculties only given to them by perception of the outside world. Now you can see why Hume was simply focusing on the way we understand, because now he has dealt a huge blow to the rationalists, because he's like, you believe you can sit here and rationalize or use pure reason alone, but everything afforded to your reason is a copy of an impression. All of your ideas are copies of your impressions. So this also takes a shot at people who believe they have original ideas as well. It's not really an original. It's, compounding from what we all sense or experience in the outside world. So now Hume is going to give us two arguments for why he believes all of our arguments are copies of our impressions. And then he gives a counterexample. So with that, we'll move on to the first argument. All of our ideas are copies of our impressions. Argument 1. So Hume states, when we analyze our thought or ideas, however compound or sublime, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copies from a precedent feeling or sentiment. And that even ideas, when at first view seem the most wide of this origin, they're found upon newer scrutiny to be derived from it. And he points to God. He starts with God, because yes, he's going to go after Descartes' idea of God here, because Hume was going after Descartes' metaphysics in the beginning, and he's not going to stop here. So he says, even this idea of God that we believe is this original idea and proves God's existence, God being infinitely intelligent, wise, and good, came from reflecting the operations of our mind, the fact that we are intelligent and that some of us are good, and augmenting without limit the qualities of goodness and wisdom to this ultimate power. And that's where God came from, Descartes. God didn't come into existence and give you this idea of him. We understand the faculties of what we call intelligence. We understand the faculties of what we call being wise. We understand the faculties of what's being good. And because our mind has this unbound liberty to augment that without limit, that is where the idea of God came from. Again, not really something I believe, but this is what Hume is saying here. So he concludes that, therefore, we shall always find that every idea which we examine is copied from a similar impression, and that there's an easy method to refute this. Produce an idea which is not derived from the source impression. So he challenges us, he challenges the reader that this is my argument. All ideas are copies and impressions, and here's an example of an idea we believe is original, God, and this is where it came from. So there's an easy way to refute this. Just come up with an idea that is not a copy of an impression. And to explain this further, if you look at the bottom of my slide, I have a little pink elephant equation going on where we believe, hey, look, a pink elephant, that's an original idea. It's a pink elephant. Well, Hume would say, no, that came from the impression of pink and an elephant that has just been compounded to create a pink elephant. So that explains his first argument, that when we analyze our thoughts, even though we believe they're original, we will find a source in an impression somewhere. And to refute this, simply find an idea that does not have a source. Now, the point of this argument isn't to show that God doesn't exist or God exists only in an impression. No. The point of this, remember Hume's overall theme, is to demonstrate how the abstruse philosophy is a subservient to the simple philosophy, to show that the rationalist mentality is a subservient to the sensory world. If all our ideas are copies of impressions, the rationalists are working with that which the outside world has impressed upon them. And that's all they have. And that's all they are given. At a fundamental level, you can't work with anything that hasn't been impressed upon you. You are limited by only that which can be impressed upon you. And that is his overall agenda. So that's Hume's first argument, and with that we're going to move into his second argument for how our ideas are copies of our impressions. All of our ideas are copies of our impressions, argument 2. So Hume states, if a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we will always find that he is little susceptible of the corresponding idea. For example, I have never tasted champagne. Therefore, I don't have the idea of what champagne tastes like. The only way for me to gain the knowledge of champagne taste, the idea of quote-unquote champagne taste, is for me to go out and taste champagne. And so this is what he's saying. You will not have an idea of something that has never been impressed upon you. Well, some may argue, well, I can explain what champagne tastes like to you. And yeah, that may be true. But that reminds me of a teacher I used to have when I was in watercoloring, or Chinese watercolor class. I was explaining to him the colors I was going to use to try to get an idea if the colors were going to work well together. And he said, do not explain to me, show me. Because no matter how well you explain it or how well you think you explain it, it will always be different than when I see it. No matter how well you explain it, it is going to be different than if it was impressed upon you. Then Hume gives an example that you can have a person who is deaf or blind, and that person is not going to have the species of sensation that they're going to be susceptible to. A deaf person is not going to have the idea of sound. A blind person, according to Hume, is not going to have the idea of color, since the only manner by which an idea can have access to the mind is by actual feeling and sensation. And he states that we see examples of this when a blind person gets their vision back. They now can have ideas of color. And when a deaf person gets their sound back, gets their hearing back, they now gain the ideas of sound. That's his second argument right there, that if you take a person that doesn't have access to a certain impression, they will not have the correlating idea. That is what he means when he says a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation. We always find that he is as little susceptible of the corresponding idea. That ends his second argument and concludes his arguments towards proving that all of our ideas are copies of impressions, but he's not done yet. Because Hume is Hume, he always likes to argue against what he just set forth. That's why a lot of people view his empiricism as being anti-empiricism, because he will also give counter examples to his arguments. And so the next slide will demonstrate the counter argument or the counter example to his argument that all ideas are copies of impressions. The missing shade of blue counterexample. So in order to give us a counterexample to his argument that all of our ideas are copies of our impressions, he needs to demonstrate that there is a certain idea that exists independent of us perceiving it or for the outside world to have impressed upon it. So he starts with one contradictory phenomenon, which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for the idea to arise independently of their corresponding impressions. Starts with, there exist several distinct ideas of color. And if it is true that there are different colors, that must be true no less of the different shades of the same color. So the idea is that if each color is distinct, if red is distinct from blue, if blue is distinct from yellow, then each shade of red must be distinct from the original red. Now, this is what he's arguing. I don't really buy it right here, and I'll get into that later. But he's saying, every single different shade is a different color. So then imagine a person who is perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds except one particular shade of blue, which means he's an artist who takes his work very seriously and he's seen all the colors that exist in a lifetime and all their shades. Just imagine, it's a thought experiment, so we're allowed these kind of extremities. Imagine he has perceived all shades and all types of colors, but he's never had the fortune to meet that one particular shade of blue. And if you look at my spectrum of the blues on the bottom of the slide, you'll see that one shade is missing, and I placed a question mark in there. So then Hume says, now I ask, whether it is possible from him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses. And even he says, I don't believe there are few who are going to disagree with this. And because of that, this demonstrates that there's a possibility to conceive an idea purely without the need for the impression, because he was acquainted with all of the colors of the world, except this one particular shade of blue. And yet it is possible for him to imagine what that shade would look like. So he is coming up with an idea without the impression of that idea being impressed upon him. He didn't witness it in the outside world. He didn't gain the knowledge from the senses. His ideas conjured them up. And then he states, this is so singular that it's scarcely worth our observing. He admits that now I've given an example of an idea coming to fruition without the necessary impression that goes along with it. But it's so singular and so mundane that it's scarcely worth our observing. And it does not merit that, for it alone should not alter the general maxim. Generally, all ideas are copies of impressions. And even though I can come up with this small counterexample, that is so mundane and minute. It's so simple that it doesn't affect the general maxim. So it's like he's just supplying a counterexample for the philosophers. But in my humble opinion, this is not a counterexample. And this is why. The world impresses upon us different shades of light. We see the sunrise. We see darkness become light. It has been impressed upon us the ability for something to become dark and into light. And so blue, the aspect of blue, was impressed upon me. He's not saying the idea of blue itself came out of nowhere, because that would be hard to say. I mean, without experiencing blue, experiencing only red and yellow, and so you can get orange and things of that nature, but never experiencing blue, it would be hard to argue that the idea of blue comes without an impression, and that is, of course, not what he's saying. So we have the idea of blue, and we have the impression of light source, or a dark source becoming a light source. So I've just merely compounded those shades of white and black into the aspect of blue, and that's how I got the missing shade. Other people argue that shades aren't different colors, but I wanted to give you guys something original. So that's why I don't believe it's a counterexample, but nevertheless, we need to understand why he believes it's a counterexample. He believed he did just show, or he did just demonstrate, that an idea came without its corresponding impression. And of course, if anybody can come up with a corresponding idea that came out of nowhere, then that would be an awesome counterexample to his whole thesis. With that, we'll move on to the conclusion and what that means for his philosophical project at the present and how he'll move on from this. Hume's conclusion. He states that all ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold of them. The ideas and concepts that we come up with are so abstract that they're naturally faint. And ideas themselves are naturally faint. Remember, they're just mirrors of impressions. They're just faint copies, dull colors, if you will, of what has been impressed upon us. But contrary, all impressions or sensations, either outward or inward, are strong and vivid. the impressions in the outside world are so strong in their vivacity that it is not easy to fall into error or make a mistake with regards to them. Ow, this hurts. This obviously inflicts pain upon me. This feeling that I'm having right now is very vivid. I understand it as something I must avoid. But then when I reflect upon it later, I'm not able to bring up that same vivacity. There's no way to fall in error when it comes to these impressions on us, or we will not easily fall into error. But our mind, since it's just a copy and that they're so faint and dull when compared to impressions, they can easily be compounded with other ideas. I believe I mentioned previously in this course Elizabeth Loftus and her experiments with eyewitness testimony. It's amazing how the mind can put things together in such a way that we believe it to be true. It is incredible the power we have to make us believe something happened when we dream it. I mean, it doesn't happen to me often, but it's happened before where my wife would wake up and, she would have a dream that I cheated on her or something. And that even though she knows it's a dream, her mind is still fooled into being mad, and bam, she smacks me. The idea here is that the mind copies impressions. And not only does it copy, it has a tendency to compound things and put things together. So in Hume's understanding, the mind can be fooled in its ability to compound things. While our impressions, the way the world impresses upon us, it's very hard to say that this doesn't hurt, or wow, this tastes delicious. No, it doesn't in fact taste delicious. It's really hard for our impressions to be fooled. And this is almost opposite of what Plato and Descartes was saying. So he goes even further to say, when we entertain any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without meaning or ideas, we need but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived. When we find ourselves discussing a philosophical term that we suspect may be, not referred to any idea, we may simply ask from what impression its supposed idea might derive. Since all ideas are derived from impressions, if they make up some term that's not connected to any impression, it's meaningless. Because I can say any word I want. To say metaphysics is the same thing as saying hablulullah. If I can't derive an impression from what you're trying to say, and all ideas are derived from impressions, it's meaningless what you're trying to tell me. And really, that's Hume's conclusion for this section. By bringing ideas into so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute concerning their nature and reality. So for the rationalists, we have shed light on where ideas come from. All ideas are copies from impressions. So your belief that you can come up with these terms that are independent of impressions is meaningless. It cannot happen. Now we need to focus on this subservience. Human knowledge is gained from impressions. If all ideas are copies of impressions and ideas are knowledge, all knowledge is a copy of an impression. So now that we know how we are limited in gaining our knowledge, we can move on from there. And that's what Hume does. He moves on to start showing how the mind compounds, how the mind rationalizes, all based on this type of subservience. Now, this ends section 2 of Hume. Post a discussion, finish the quiz before Sunday, and of course, post a response.
Section 3 is very short, so Section 3 and 4 are combined for the next reading and lecture. Have a great day.